Alright, hello everybody, and welcome to Mistaken Truths. This is me, Skin with the Carnotaurus, and yes, we're finally doing this. So, I'd like to thank all of you for waiting for God knows how long for this to come out. It's been a long, nearly 6 months now? No, it's easily been 6 months. So yeah, I apologize. Hopefully the rest won't take this length amount of time. A whole bunch of things happened in that time. So, yeah, forgive me. So basically the format that we're going to be doing for this is going to be more of a slideshow type thing, where there's going to be pictures up, and I'll basically use them as like a template for me to just discuss with you guys. So yeah, the series was originally going to be edited video, like with how most people do it, how Trey does it, how Slot does it, how most people do it, but quite frankly I don't think I really got the time to edit all that in, especially for this episode in particular, which is absolutely massive. So yeah, sorry for the people that have like just got out of school or just finishing school, but it's going to be something similar to that. But hopefully, because it's dinosaurs and y'all love dinosaurs, it's not going to be that big of a deal. So yeah, so to start off with, we got Walking with Dinosaurs. It's going to encompass the entire trilogy, as you'll see in a minute. But yeah, there's a disclaimer here. All artwork in this presentation is purely for showcase purposes. I do not claim any of it as my own, and I recommend checking every single artist out because they're all amazing. Treff Rex in particular, we're going to see a lot of his art in this slideshow. But so seriously, I recommend that you check all the artists out, and if you don't know where an art is from and you want to find more of that guy's stuff, just ask Soul in the comments, and I'll try and find the artwork again and be able to tell you who it is. So yeah, let's get started. So as we got here, we got the entire trilogy going on here. We're going to do it in chronological order. So we got Walking with Dinosaurs here, Battle of Big Al here, Walking with Beasts, Chased by Dinosaurs, Chased by Sea Monsters, and Walking with Monsters. Alright, so let's see. Getting started right now is Coelophysis, the signature Triassic dinosaur. So yeah, with this guy, it's more of just typical theropod issues, more along the lines of it's a little bit too skinny. This guy ain't that too bad. There's ones in this series that are a lot worse, but this guy in here, yeah, he's a bit too skinny. His head's like a bit of a bobblehead, as you can see here. While on this head, it's a little bit short. The head's a lot smaller and more in proportion than in comparison with the old one. And the Coelophysis also has pronated hands. We know that theropods, they can only put their hands in a clap position or move them up, or move the palms upwards. They couldn't move them downwards. It was physically impossible. They would have broken their wrists if they tried to do that. So yeah, it's basically that. And one other thing for Coelophysis is, even though it's known as the Triassic dinosaur, it wasn't just Triassic. If you look here, the time in which new blood takes place is in the Norian, 220 million years ago, so it'd be about here, where my mouse is. But Coelophysis actually lived around here. It lived during the Triassic-Jurassic boundary, so it was one of these species that saw the Triassic-Jurassic mass extinction. And yeah, it lived much later. Coelophysis wouldn't have evolved yet, nor would have been in the series at all. It shouldn't have been in there. Moving on, we got Postosuchus, my personal favorite creature from this episode. It's part of the Rauisuchians, as they're called. That's more of a layman's term now. Scientists are now thinking that's just a general, like, almost waste bin taxon kind of deal, and that they're starting to get split up into their own individual groups. But Postosuchus in particular is a Rauisuchid, so it's still technically accurate for him. So yeah, in terms of aesthetic, this guy ain't really that bad. He's got like the typical kind of a dinosaur, but sort of also a crocodile look to him, which is, as far as I know, accurate. However, there are two main issues with her. The main one in the episode was a she, if I recall. The main two issues are, one, its size, and two, its posture. So if we look down here, at this picture, this is an accurate representation of a Postosuchus next to a person. It was much smaller than it was portrayed in Walking with Dinosaurs. In Walking with Dinosaurs, they said it was around 6 meters in length, I believe, and in reality, it was along the lines of 4 meters. So it wasn't like half the size or anything, but it was sort of there, basically. It was quite a bit smaller. And then over here we got the posture. So recently, they did a study on one of Postosuchus' relatives, Postosuchus, and they found that the Rauisuchian, using that term very, very loosely again, the Rauisuchian forelimbs and the hands, they really showed no adaptations for actually being used for walking at all. So, odds are they weren't actually used for walking, and they were bipeds. They were obligate bipeds like the dinosaurs were, like the theropod dinosaurs were, which in my opinion makes them like a whole lot scarier. But yeah, that's something new. I guess they thought it might have been too big and heavy to go biped, but the evidence right now supports it being living as a biped. So interesting. Moving on, we got Thrinaxodon here, or as it's called in the episode, Cynodon. But yeah, the actual species is Thrinaxodon. My bad. And if we look here, yeah, looking at it, it's fairly spot on. They might have gone a little bit like too little hair, but it's not that big of a deal. And yeah, the main two issues are the time and place that this guy lived. Thrinaxodon in particular actually lived during very, very early Triassic, like just after the Great Dying happened, around 248 million years ago, in contrast to when the episode took place. So this guy should have already been extinct. And if we look down here, Thrinaxodon was found in South Africa rather than in North America, where New Blood takes place. And yeah, I know technically it's not 100% wrong, because Pangea, everything's all connected and stuff, so therefore it's not out of the question completely. But animals are still confined to certain regions on a continent, let alone on a single supercontinent. So I have high doubts that Thrinaxodon actually lived in North America at all, considering no fossils have been found there. I know we have a lot to get through, but I gotta calm down. So, yeah, next up we got Peteinosaurus, which in general, this is a main issue with all the pterosaurs in this trilogy. They got the very, very typical, the main two pterosaur issues. One of them being that the wing structure is sort of like very, very pointy, as you can see here, in contrast to the more accurate one, which got more rounded wingtips. And then you also got the lack of pycnofibers all over, which we know all pterosaurs have as of now. And the one other issue this guy has is the place, like Thrinaxodon. New Blood takes place in North America, Arizona to be specific, but Peteinosaurus is Italian. We've only found fossils of them in Italy, so it's a European species. So yeah, it shouldn't have been there. And I think finally we got Plateosaurus. Now this guy's sort of got a combination of Peteinosaurus and Coelophysis problems. And Postosuchus too, actually. Yeah, if we look here. Here we got the... So yeah, if I didn't explain these pictures before, these are the ones by Trefrex. And up here we got his like illustration of the Walk with Dinosaurs version, and then the accurate version down here. And if we look here, the first issue that we're going to talk about is the posture. Similar to Rauisuchians, I'm going to keep putting parentheses around that, or not parentheses, quotations around that. Like the Rauisuchians, they were found out that they were obligate bipeds as well. Their arms couldn't pronate, similar to theropod dinosaurs. Their arms are no different than from theropod dinosaurs, so they couldn't exactly walk on them properly without some issues. So, yeah, as it turns out, they were obligate bipeds. So if you guys play Zoo Tycoon 2 at all with the Walking with Dinosaurs mod pack, the Plateosaurus, how it moves in there is actually more accurate to the one in the actual show. And then if we look down here, it lived during the same time as Coelophysis, the Triassic-Jurassic boundary. So yeah, it wouldn't have evolved yet. It wouldn't be around yet as of the time of this episode. And it's also completely European. Plateosaurus fossils are incredibly common, even being found in some of the very, very northernmost countries like Norway. But they're entirely European. They haven't been found anywhere else, whether it be North America, Africa, or Asia. So, yeah, it wouldn't been there either. Alright, so now we're moving on to Time of the Titans. So, if we look here, we got Diplodocus. Now, this is just going to be a little bit of both discrepancies and, well, actual inaccuracies. So if we look here, this guy's slightly shrink wrapped. It always bothers me when the skull is like very visibly, like very, very obvious in comparison to the neck. Like it is in here, when in reality would blend into the neck more naturally. But yeah, I might as well talk about the actual main inaccuracies first. So the first one is the neck posture. This was back during a time when we thought all sauropods sort of like had their necks horizontally, or at least most of them. However, we now think that pretty much all sauropods have their neck in a more like half vertical, half horizontal manner. So not completely vertical like the typical Brachiosaurus, and not completely horizontal like this Diplodocus, but more in a halfway type of deal. Like this one does. It's not like solid 90 degrees, it's more in between. And then the other one is how they depicted sauropod nesting, because we have found actual sauropod nests, and how they're depicted in the episode is that they just dug a hole in the ground, laid the eggs, buried them, and then just left them, like with sea turtles, which as far as we know isn't correct. They made actual nests. But yeah, what we know of actual sauropod nests is that they made actual nests. They didn't just leave a hole. They didn't just dig up a hole, lay the eggs in there, and then bury it and leave it. That's not how they worked. Now the final issue is more of just like, it's more of a film discrepancy than anything else, is the actual size of the animals. Now they did say, like they gave the actual estimate of 90 feet or 27 meters, which isn't bad at all. Diplodocus did get that big. But I'm talking about the main issue here. If we talk about like these two shots right here. So if we see here, this is what's shown to be an around subadult, getting into adult Diplodocus here. And judging by the size of the Allosaurus next to it, it's probably around 60 feet in length or 18 meters about, give or take. And after the attack is all over, this is it next to a fully grown individual. And I'm just looking at here like, that's like Amphicoelus levels of ridiculous in terms of size. I don't really know what they were necessarily thinking with that, but yeah, moving on. Ornitholestes. So, yeah, there's more of along the lines of a basal Coelurosaur. So if we look here, yeah, odds are, along with most Coelurosaurs, it would have had a full coating of feathers along its body, in contrast to the Allosaurus that this guy's raiding a nest from right now, which, as far as we know, they're still scaly as far as we know, but they easily couldn't have been. And you might notice in these two pictures here that it doesn't have a nose crest, and that's because odds are it didn't actually have one. The only known specimen that we have, Ornitholestes, right here, if you notice, it's got a somewhat damaged skull, and if you look here at the nose, a bit of it is like crushed and missing. So I add this little bit of wiring here to where you can sort of see why they think they'd have a crest of some form, but no, looking at it in comparison to other relatives and such, there's really no evidence that it actually had a crest. So it just, that pretty little nose horn that it has there probably didn't actually have it. Next up is Othnielosaurus, or as it was called in the show, Othnielia. There's a name change. So the main issue with these is the lack of feathers, as far as we know, based on creatures like species like Calindodromaeus. That name, it's one of the few dinosaur names I can't actually spell, but besides the point. As far as we know, these guys did have feathers, basically, if we just go off the phylogenetic evidence, essentially. We know that the bigger guys, like the Hadrosaurs and Iguanodons, probably didn't have feathers, but as far as we know, the more primitive early forms here, the more primitive ornithopods, they did have feathers. So there we go. Same with Dryosaurus, which only made like a very, very, very brief cameo in Time of Titans. It wasn't even given a name. But yeah, it's essentially the same deal, basically. The head's a little bit too big on these as well. And yeah, it lacks feathers as well. Next up we got Anurognathus, the tiny, tiny little pterosaurs that are up and up around the sauropods. And these guys have the same typical pterosaur issues as well: two pointy wings, lack of pycnofibers. And I'm fairly sure it's a very, very popular Anurognathid depiction to sort of have it webbed between the tail and the legs. So that may or may not be accurate. I'm not too sure. There might be actual fossil evidence behind that, but I do not know of that myself, so forgive me. And the main issue behind this guy, besides aesthetic, is the fact that he's also a European species. He's only known from Germany, so he wouldn't be in the American Midwest, where Times of Titans takes place. And now we got Dung Beetles. So the main thing Walk with Dinosaurs got right is that Dung Beetles essentially did evolve to feed off the dung of dinosaurs. That is the main reason why they evolved in the first place. However, they sort of chose the wrong time to bring it up, because as far as we know, Dung Beetles first evolved in the early Cretaceous, around 30 or so million years after Times of Titans. So, just a little bit too early, Dung Beetles. Your time will come, just not yet. Alright, so now we got Allosaurus, which might as well be the flagship of the entire Welcome to Dinosaurs trilogy, because of just how iconic the animal in the show is. Which is very, very odd, because in my opinion, they did a pretty shoddy job with the Allosaurus, how it's like physically depicted in Welcome to Dinosaurs. The skull in particular is very, very messed up. Like, it's also got the pronated hands, which most theropods in the show have. That's the main issue they have. Ornitholestes also had that issue. I forgot to bring that up. But, yeah. Allosaurus does have these distinct crests above the eyes. However, it was shown here, they were very, very, very distinct, to the point where they were kind of ridiculous. It felt sort of like I call them somewhat Pinocchio horns, in a sense. And odds are it also supported a longer ridge along the nose, possibly. Which is also completely unpresent on the ones in Welcome to Dinosaurs. They just got the big pointed horns. Here, essentially these two on the right should be more what it looks like, not essentially this one on the left. So the final thing about Time of Titans is they sort of made this point at the end that sauropods eventually declined and practically disappeared by the time the Cretaceous period came around. And they were eventually replaced by the armored Ankylosaurs and Ceratopsids, as well as the Hadrosaurs, which is not really true. It might just be because they didn't have as much of an understanding of sauropod evolution back then as they did now. But as far as we know, sauropods did just fine throughout the entirety of the Mesozoic. The Diplodocids, or the ones that made up most of the successful Jurassic species, like Supersaurus, Diplodocus, Postosuchus, and things like that. The Diplodocids, they were kind of hit hard by the time the Cretaceous rolled around, but even then they still existed up throughout the first half of the Cretaceous. Amargasaurus in particular here is a form of Diplodocid, as far as I know, which is one of the Cretaceous species. And then up here we got Argentinosaurus, which is another Cretaceous species, which is part of the Titanosaurs, which are the most successful sauropods of the Cretaceous. They easily rival the size of Diplodocus that we got here, which was one of the biggest sauropods of the late Jurassic. So, yeah, while Diplodocids might have been hard hit, the sauropod group in general, not really, I think. They did just fine until the extinction hit them 66 million years ago, which wiped out all the dinosaurs. So yeah, now we're going to get into cruel seas. Now this is the first case that we're going to see of the Giga effect here. So if we look here, the Titonian, this is essentially, the Jurassic is split up into a couple of epochs, the early, middle, and late, and throughout all these epochs there's also ages. So if we look here, so the actual episode takes place during the Titonian, which is around 150 million years ago, but the species that were shown in it were kind of scattered all about. So if we look here, Ammonite and Hybotus, these guys lived all throughout the Mesozoic. They're not that big of an issue. Same with Rhamphorhynchus and Ophthalmosaurus. They are known from the Tithonian as well. But there are a ton of other species which aren't here, these three in particular. So if you look here, we got Liopleurodon, which is found from the Chidorygian. Don't know if I pronounced that correctly. From the Colovian to the Kimmeridgian, my mistake, which was around 155 million years ago. So it was a good 5 million years or so earlier, but when we're talking about like rock ages and stuff, it's actually kind of important. And then if we got the Cryptoclidus, it's also found in the Colovian as well as the Eustreptospondylus, which was the around 160 million year old range. So yeah, so most of these guys wouldn't have been around yet by the time, but these guys would have already been extinct by the time Cruel Seas rolled around, while Ophthalmosaurus, Rhamphorhynchus, and these two over here would have been mostly fine. So next up we got Eustreptospondylus with this easily my favorite shot of the entire Walking with trilogy. Don't tell me when you were a kid and you saw that you didn't lose your mind completely. But aside from that, yeah, it's sort of cool to see a megalosaur among all these other theropod dinosaurs. Megalosaurs in particular are sort of underrepresented in dinosaur documentaries in general, which is sort of interesting because they're the group that gave rise to the Spinosaurus, but that's besides the point. So the main thing with this guy is mostly shrink wrapping issues. If we look here, you can clearly see the big hole in the skull, which is simply there to hollow it out a bit to give it more space, and then you got the eye hole here, and then you got the ear hole here, which it really shouldn't be. In life, those would have been somewhat invisible. Like, you can look here and see, you can clearly see the skull holes here, but not quite here. And that's just in general, along with the rest of the body. There's got to be a bit more muscle on this particular Streptospondylus. Its arms could also go pronated, I think, but that's true with all theropods in the show. So even if I don't really say it, try to take that into consideration. Alright, so here we got Lealpleurodon. Lealpleurodon, so gotta love how Walk with Dinosaurs took a giant leap in speculation that influenced pop culture of dinosaurs so much. So if you didn't know yet, which I would be surprised if you didn't, it's pretty well known by now, Lealpleurodon was not actually 80 feet, or what would that be, 24 meters. That's not really the case. Or 21 to 24 meters, depending on which version of the show you watch. It was much, much, much smaller than that. Would have been, this is a pretty accurate representation alongside a human here. The biggest individuals got to around 6 meters, and that's about it. This is an accurate scale between an accurate Lealpleurodon and the Walking with Dinosaurs version. They took such a massive leap, which I believe, if the book has anything to say, that it was sort of taken because of some pliosaur vertebrae, which was found around the time from Central America, which indicated that there could be a Lealpleurodon as big as that, but as far as we know now, that's not really the case. Hell, no pliosaur got this big. The biggest pliosaur we know of, Kronosaurus, got to 13 meters at most, and most were around the 9 to 12 meter range. So, yeah, way too large. Way too large. And there's also some issues with just the morphology of Lealpleurodon in general here. It's got this very, very slender neck, with the skull joint being very, very apparent here. This bump here is where the back of the skull, where it meets the neck, which is very, very bizarre. You could sort of see what I'm talking about when you look at the more accurate version here. Because Pliosaurus had these very, very powerful jaws, and they would have needed powerful muscles to back that up, which means that they probably had very, very, very thick necks. Which is why I find it very odd that they give it such a thin neck in this one. And they also, all Plesiosaurs, as far as we know, also had a tail fluke, which the Liopleurodon, as well as pretty much every single other Plesiosaur in the show, does not have. Speaking of other Plesiosaurs, we got Cryptoclidus. So, there's actually a lot to talk about with him, which actually somewhat caught me off guard when I was researching this Mistaken Truths. So the first thing I want to bring up is his size. He is oversized, similar to Lealpleurodon. In the show, they say he's around 8 meters in length, 25 feet, but in reality, they were around 3 meters or 10 feet. They were much, much, much smaller than they were in Cruel Seas. And another thing worthy mention of, because you don't really see it on this species here, but you don't really see it on this representation here. But there was a recent finding of like soft tissue on a short-necked plesiosaur. I forgot the name. It's like Marinosaurus or something like that. But it was discovered earlier this year. And they found like the actual flipper structure is such as slightly different from what's normally represented. Like this is the average traditional, as it's dubbed here, flipper here. And if we look here, odds are there's actually some more muscles to back that up, which will result in a much more paddle-like shape to the flipper. It seems more reminiscent of like a sea turtle than of an actual arm and hand being used to swim here. Similar to the Leopleurodon, also lacks a tail fluke. It's a bit shrink-wrapped. Once again, the head's a bit of a bobblehead-ish compared to the rest of the body. And the other main thing is it being land-dwelling, which, as far as we know, there's no evidence to support Cryptoclidus in particular actually being capable of hauling itself onto land. And as far as we know, all plesiosaurs couldn't. Their bodies just couldn't support their weight on land. They weren't adapted to that. So, yeah, that's out of the question. Moving on. Ophthalmosaurus. Now, for the most part, they actually did this guy correctly. I appreciate that they said that that Ophthalmosaurs were mostly deep water species, and that they were only in the reefs because of circumstance, more or less, which is appropriate. They have these giant eyes for a reason. They were open ocean hunters that went down deep into the ocean after fish. There are actual vertebrate. There's actual vertebrate Ophthalmosaurus, which suggests that they did occasionally get the bends from escaping predators by shooting up to the surface. So that's pretty interesting. So yeah, the main thing I want to talk about is coloration. So, while we don't know the color of most extinct animals, we do know it for some, and one of them is the Ichthyosaurus. So, if we look here, odds are for Ichthyosaurus, this was done on an early Jurassic species, but if we look at it's like, if what the coloration suggests by its behavior, then we can somewhat correlate the same to Ophthalmosaurus to suggest it has similar coloration. Open water Ichthyosaurs like Ophthalmosaurus most likely had jet black, or like a jet single color coloration, a jet darker color, like a sperm whale of today. Unlike this a very, very cool pattern, I admit, but still probably not a totally accurate one. And yeah, this is an accurate representation of mosasaur coloration as well, which we will talk about later. So now we're going to get to probably the most complicated part of this episode. Or the most complicated part of this, of this episode, which is the Ornithocheirus issue. So I'm going to try to take this a bit more slow, so you guys know what I'm talking about, so forgive me. But yeah, essentially, the entire premise of this episode, of the oldest living individual traveling halfway around the world to the breeding grounds, it isn't necessarily correct. The entire episode has completely invalidated itself by this point. And that's because of a couple of reasons. The main one is due to the fact that Ornithocheirus itself is purely European. We've only found their fossils in Europe. In contrast to and none in South America. However, the funny part is, its very, very close relative, Tupandactylus, is a South American species. It's Brazilian. Now, the main interesting bit about this is, I believe that around the time of Walking with Dinosaurs, when it was being made, there was a bit of discussion on whether or not these two different but very, very similar genus were the same, essentially. There was like a debate going on about that, which, as it turns out, never really got anywhere. They still decided they were two different genus. They never merged together at all. But I believe that the debate was enough to sort of get what grew dinosaurs to merge them together and make the story out of it. But yeah, basically two completely different genus. And what makes this even more confusing is the size here. Ornithocheirus did not have a 12-meter long wingspan. It simply didn't. Some pterosaurs did, but not Ornithocheirus. Ornithocheirus was more along the lines of actually half that size, 6 meters. That was more along the lines of a typical Ornithocheirus. The South American cousin, Dryosaurus, actually did get bigger at around 8 to 9 meter wingspan, but neither of them hit the massive proportions that the massive 12 meters wide Ornithocheirus did. So yeah, that entire episode couldn't actually have happened. So next up we got Tupandactylus, or as it's called, Tapeyara in the show. So Tupandactylus is actually a very recent species. It was something that was sort of made because of its divergence from Tapeyara. Oop, forgive me here. This is the iron boarding from the Ornitholestes slide. But yeah, just ignore that. This guy doesn't just have a fancy eye patch or whatever. But yeah, essentially there used to be 3 different species of Tapeyara, which you can see here, all represented by different crest shapes. This is the one in Walking with Dinosaurs. However, since Walking with Dinosaurs, it's actually been split into 2 different genus. This one right here is still Tapeyara, but these 2 here are in an entirely new genus called Tupandactylus. So the one that we see in Walk with Dinosaurs isn't actually Tapeyara anymore, it's Tupandactylus. And this guy also has a typical pterosaur problems with the more pointed wingtips, as well as the pycnofibers as well. So now we're going to move on to the Iguanodons, basically. So Walking with Dinosaurs was made in around a time when Iguanodon was more along the lines of a wastebin taxon. They sort of just put any Iguanodon looking thing in there, and as a result, that was what made Iguanodon be considered a worldwide species. But that's not really the case. Iguanodon was purely European, early Cretaceous, 125 million years ago. So yeah, that North American species that is briefly seen is actually what's called Dakotadon. Alright, so Polacanthus. So appearance-wise, this guy's actually not that bad. The only main problem with him is his appearance briefly alongside the Dakotadon, as you can see here, is it being in North America. It's purely European. It's especially known from the Isle of Wight, which is the same place we got the actual Iguanodon here, unlike Dakotadon, which is a brand new genus that was broken off from Iguanodon. And then we got Neovenator, and then some freshwater and brackish water pliosaurs and crocodiles and all these other pterosaurs here. This particular pterosaur we're actually going to look at in a little bit, but yeah. This guy's European, not North American. We do see him in Europe later, but we first see him in North America, which is not correct. So next up we got Plesiopleurodon here. So this picture here isn't actually Plesiopleurodon, it's Kronosaurus, but it's pretty close, I think. So this guy's it's a reused model and animation shot from Cruel Seas with Liopleurodon, so it's got the same problems that it has, the general morphology issues, but it's also got a place issue and a time issue actually. So this Plesiopleurodon lived later on in the Cretaceous, around 95 million years ago, as far as I know, and it also lived its fossils were found in Wyoming, which if we look here at this general map of the early Cretaceous at around Ornithocheirus' time, if we look here, he started out here in the Brazilian area, and then he went over here, up and around the east coast, until he went across to the European Isles. And nowhere in this time would he most likely have actually seen Plesiopleurodon. He might have seen other pliosaurs, we don't know, but as far as we know, Wyoming at this time was a shallow seaway that was up here. So normally, if this was actually connected to the Gulf of Mexico, I would have let it slide, but in this case, not really. He shouldn't have seen that Plesiopleurodon character. Next up, we got Caulkicephalus, which is actually a fairly recently discovered pterosaur. It was named in 2005, but as far as I know, it was the influence of several depictions of pterosaurs at around the time, as far as I know. I do not know as much of this compared to other things. But yeah, that very weird pteranodon-looking pterosaur, as far as we know, it's attributed to this species right here, which looks quite a bit different from the one seen in the show here. It's a bit more robust, it's got the pycnofibers, it's got more noticeable teeth, and it's also got a more Ornithocheirus, like, nasal or bill crest up in here. That's why I've always found this species a little bit interesting, because it's sort of like a combination of a typical pteranodon but also an Ornithocheirus. It looks like a hybrid almost, but it was an actual species. So I believe finally for this episode is the Utahraptor, which obviously it's the main take on why weren't there feathers on these dinosaurs, but that's besides the point. To me, it doesn't matter how old these are. I just gotta say how representative they are up to current knowledge. So if you look here, the Utahraptor at this time was more along the lines based on Deinonychus, a sized up Deinonychus, because of the fairly recent. Utahraptor at this time was actually fairly recent, so they didn't know as much about it as they do now. So they essentially just made an upscaled Deinonychus in the show, which was not really the case. It was more, if we look here, it was a bit more bulky. Not a bit of a shorter neck than this, a more robust head, more robust body in general, and also feathers. Full coating of feathers, as we know a majority of Splosaurs had. And then the biggest issue, the one that everybody points out, is the place. Why do we see the Utahraptors in Europe? They're called Utahraptors. They were found in Utah of the United States of North America. They were not found in Europe. So why was Utahraptor in Europe? Beats me. I guess they wanted to incorporate him somewhere, but they felt that Utahraptors were a bit too early in the story for when. Would have been a bit too early in the story if they were in North America. Who knows? So next up we got Spirits of the Ice Forest, which also has a bit of issues with the Giga effect. The episode takes place at about here, 105, 110 million years ago, which is fairly accurate to a couple of them, like Leallynasaura, Steropodon, and Muttaburrasaurus. However, it's not the case for Coelophysis, which is much earlier, around 115, 120 million years ago in the Aptian, and the dwarf Allosaur, now called Australovenator, which is the Cenomanian, around 95 million years ago. So, yeah, so this guy shouldn't have evolved yet, and Coelophysis should have already been extinct. And finally, the main thing is, why did they make it take place in Antarctica? Why did they do that? These are literally all Australian species, Australia, which is part of the Arctic Circle anyway. So why did they suddenly decide, let's just move all the Australian dinosaurs over to Antarctica, so it makes much more literal sense that they're polar dinosaurs? You could have just called it Australia and just made the clarification that it was much farther south than it was now. Then it would have been fine, but I guess not. Beats me. I don't know the decisions. So moving on. So Leallynasaura, not Leallynasaura. This isn't just Allosaura with, Allosaura, Leallynasaura, whatever. But yeah, Leallynasaura. This guy's got the same typical small ornithopod issues, lack of feathers, pronated hands as well. I forgot to point that out with the Dryosaurus and Othnielosaurus. And the other main thing is just the general body proportions. Leallynasaura had a much smaller head and a much longer tail. It's sort of ridiculous how long the tail had in comparison to its body size. You can sort of see the length of it here. It's kind of ridiculous. So yeah, this is what more along the lines looked like in life in comparison to this one. So next up we got Australovenator, which in my opinion is sort of the most interesting dinosaur from this episode because of what we now know about it. So at the time, Australovenator was undescribed, and all that we knew of it was just an ankle bone, which looked quite similar to Allosaurus. So they thought it must be like a smaller Australian species of Allosaurus, but no, not quite. That's not really how science works anymore. So now recently, I believe it was 2010, 2009, 2010, somewhere around there, they found Australovenator properly, and it turned out to look a lot more like this than it did of a typical Allosaur. In fact, Australovenator is not an Allosaur at all. It belonged to the very, very, very recently discovered family called Megaraptorans, which were essentially large theropods, which were sort of like raptors, but instead of having the sickle claws on their feet, they had them on their hands. So if you look here, they got this. Australovenator had this one giant claw that I probably used to grab at and grapple with prey. And there are a couple of other species that are known from the group, the biggest of which being Ceats. And then you also got the namesake of the family, Megaraptor, right here. And then the latest living of the family here, Muttaburrasaurus here. Megaraptorans are also sort of interesting because we don't really know right now where they actually fit on the theropod family tree. It's very, very debated right now. Originally, they were placed as a family of Allosauroids, like Allosaurus, and Carcharodontosaurs, like Iguanodon. But now they're thinking more along the lines of maybe they're Sauropod, like Ornitholestes and raptors and such. Maybe even Tyrannosauroids, like with the Proceratosaurs, like Utahraptor, and the actual Tyrannosaurs, like Tyrannosaurus. But for now, it's completely a mystery. It can easily change within the next couple of years. We have no idea as of this recording. So next up we got Muttaburrasaurus, which all around is alright. The bulging out of the skull here once again raises a few flags, but that's besides the point. Once again, the main issue, the pronated hands and such. You can sort of see the more pronated posture of the hands here. And also the main issue with this guy, more along the lines, is not really the actual anatomical issues, but more along the size issues. If we look here, they emphasized in the episode how huge Muttaburrasaurus was. It made the dwarf Allosaur look tiny. And I believe they made him around 12 meters. I'm not exactly sure if it was actually specified, but they were smaller than that, around 9 meters in length. So there we go. So finally we have Steropodon, which was live acted by a Quadamundi, as you can see here. Which is not necessarily how it looked like, essentially. Steropodon was a monotreme, or egg-laying mammal, and actually would have looked more along the lines of this. A platypus creature, essentially. Whether or not it was land or aquatic, I do not know. The lack of a flipper-like tail here suggests to me that it isn't aquatic, but I actually do not know. Don't quote on that. So now we're starting to wrap up the actual main documentary here with Death of a Dynasty. So here we got the Dilophodon, the biggest mammal that lived during the time of T-Rex, and while it is portrayed fine enough, its general anatomy is a bit off. It looks a lot like a typical. It's a lot more badger-like in this depiction, in contrast to when we actually have a skeleton here. It looks a lot more otter or weasel-like than the more robust and short and stout version here. And then we got Tyrannosaurus. I'm just gonna play this real quick.
Bruh, look at this dude. Wait till you see the. No, 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 no. Look at the top of his head. Look at his lips.
But yeah, everybody rips on this Tyrannosaurus model, and rightfully so. It is horrific. We got the bobble head up here, the ridiculously thin neck, the pronated hands, and the wimpy tail. And I don't really know what they were thinking when they cooked up this Tyrannosaurus. They might have deliberately made it not as appealing, so it'd be on par with the rest of the cast of species in the documentary. But all they did was make the T-Rex in that seem a bit like a laughingstock, which is unfortunate. So it should look more along the lines of this. This is R.J. Palmer's drawing here. Very, very thick neck, giant jaws, muscular tail, very, very robust body and not quite as long legs, very, very thick, stout legs in contrast to the ones here. So now we're going to talk about the habitat of Hell Creek, which is the general area that T-Rex lived in. And yes, that is Saurian. You're going to see a bit more of this plugged in as we talk about Death of a Dynasty. They essentially thought that there was a lot of, and I mean a lot of volcanic activity, which led to a lot of volcanic ash fields and smoke rising up in the air, and that this great climate change was causing dinosaurs to get wiped out even before the meteorite was coming. It just made it a lot more quicker for them, which is not necessarily correct. As far as we know, dinosaurs did just as fine throughout the entirety of their time up until the KT 66 million years ago. But yeah, the general climate that Tyrannosaurus lived in wasn't like this either. It wasn't mostly volcanic ash with the occasional island of greenery like it was in the documentary. It was more along the lines of floodplains and such like that. As you can see here, it's vibrant, it's green, it's bright. We got a Dakotadon and then a herd Triceratops here, but yeah. Moving on to Thescelosaurus here, which is only a very, very, very brief cameo. It wasn't even mentioned by name. We didn't even really get good shots of it here. It uses the Othnielosaurus model here, which is not really that correct. As you can see here, this is a more accurate representation of Thescelosaurus with feathers and such, and a more thin head, more accurate body, non-pronated hands and such. Next up we got Dromaeosaurus, which shares a model but different color palette to the Utahraptor. So yeah, the main two issues with this guy are the appearance and also the time. If we look here, it obviously is missing a full coating of feathers and also the pronated hands, which we know raptors didn't have. Look more along the lines of this, giant groundhogs, yada yada yada. However, the other big issue is the time period. Dromaeosaurus lived during the Campanian, around 75 million years ago, which was a solid 10 million years before T-Rex lived. It should already be extinct by now, by the time that Death of a Dynasty took place. Dromaeosaurus did not see the mass extinction 66 million years ago. So next up, we're moving on to Edmontosaurus or Anatosaurus. I'm not gonna get myself involved in that fight, but main thing, it's called Anatotitan in the series, but in reality it's called either Edmontosaurus or Anatotitan, or Anatosaurus or Edmontosaurus. Whatever side you're on, I don't really care. I'm going by the current science right now with Edmontosaurus, basically. Fight me on that. But yeah. Moving on, we got Ankylosaurus. Now the two main issues with this guy were the size and the general appearance. The Ankylosaurus in the show could only be described as thick. It had this giant ball-shaped body with the legs, head, and tail sticking out, which is not really the case. It was more along the lines of the body was still round, but it was much more elongated. It wasn't as balled up as this, and the arrangement of the osteoderms and such is a bit meh. And it was also a little bit smaller than it was in Walking with Dinosaurs. Walking with Dinosaurs made up to be like 9 meters in length, which is not correct. It was around 6 meters or so. It didn't really get that much bigger. So now we're moving on to the very brief cameo of Quetzalcoatlus, which was very, very brief. Didn't really appear that much, which is very odd, being the biggest pterosaur of all time and all, but whatever. This guy's got the same typical pterosaur issues: lack of pycnofibers, rounded wingtips, and this guy also has teeth. This is something I did not notice until making this video. The Quetzalcoatlus has teeth. Why does it have teeth? Quetzalcoatlus did not have teeth. Neither did most pterosaurs at the end of the Age of Dinosaurs, I think. So, yeah, why? It makes no sense. Incorrect crest here, just an edited Ornithocheirus model. Just very, very bizarre. This is a more accurate depiction on the right here. This is what Quetzalcoatlus actually looked like here. And another thing to emphasize is that, like similar to with the dinosaurs, where they thought they were already dying out by the time the KT hit, they thought the same for the pterosaurs. but it was for a different reason. Instead of climate change, they thought that birds were actually taking over and outcompeting the pterosaurs to extinction. It was a popular theory at the time, which is not correct anymore. Pterosaurs, once again, did just fine until the KT 66 million years ago. So now we got Deinosuchus, which, once again, very brief cameo like the Quetzalcoatlus, didn't even get mentioned by name. It just appeared. And there are a couple of things wrong with this. It was given this very Sarcosuchus-like snout, which is not the case. It was much more along the lines of an alligator or Nile crocodile. It was much, much thicker along the lines, much more broad, much like a typical American alligator. And it also should have been extinct by now as well. It lived during the companion with Dromaeosaurus around 75 million years ago. It wouldn't have lived to see the KT mass extinction. So finally, for Time of Titans, we have Deinonychia. Forgive me if I pronounce that wrong. But yeah, it was live acted by either a boa constrictor or a red-tailed boa. I do not know. I'm not that big of a reptile guy. I have a snake, but I don't know reptiles all that much. So, very, very specific reptile species, so forgive me on that. But, yeah, this guy's got a whole bunch of combination of problems. First of all, Deinonychia was more of a burrowing species. For all we know, because it had this very, very distinct snout, which was very, very blunt, which would make it very useful as like a shovel for digging. So odds are it was a burrowing species that sort of hid and waited for prey to come by, in contrast to a constrictor like a boa. It lived in South America. I believe Argentina, but once again, don't quote me on that. Not North America, up in the Hell Creek region. It lived during the Campanian, around 80 million years ago. Not the Maastrichtian, which is the age T-Rex lived in. It didn't live in the Maastrichtian 66 million years ago. So now we're going into the Ballad of Big Al, which was essentially sort of like a redux of Time of Titans, except that it did fix some things, in particular with the Allosaurus. The skull did get a lot better in this version. It created the ridge that the Allosaurus skull does have. However, it did sort of tone down the eye ridge just a little bit too much, possibly. They did go out to fix it, and somewhat succeeded, but at the same time still didn't. It's a bit odd. Then you also still got the straight grass skull here. You can still see the 3 distinct holes in the skull here, which would not have been apparent in life at all. And then we also have the Dryosaurus here, which was given a complete rehaul for Ballad of Big Al. It was given the more... I mean, this right here is alright. The only main problems I could think of here are both the lack of feathers and the pronated hands here. Dryosaurus was a basal iguanodon, so odds are it might not have had feathers, maybe, but as far as we know, as long as they stayed small, they probably did have feathers. Oh, and then there's a Postosuchus, this completely new addition to the Walking With series that only appeared in Battle of Big Al. Now, I really like this version. It actually has the appropriate amount of meat on its bones. It actually feels bulky and huge and stuff like that. The only issue, again, with it is the same thing with the Diplodocus with the neck structure. It should be further up high, like with how this illustration shows right here. Alright, so now we're going to move on to Walking With Beasts. So for this first episode, the main issues derive from the predator characters. So right here we got Gastornis, which in the episode was shown as the top predator. The fierce predator. This is a world where birds eat horses, that sort of thing. As this picture here is quite literally showing. However, we now know that's not necessarily the case. Gastornis was actually a herbivore. We know this through testing the various amounts of calcium in their bones and figuring out. You can basically determine the diet of an animal based on the type of calcium in its bones. And we went through on that with Gastornis, and there's really no evidence that it ate meat at all. So odds are that more blunt beak was meant for cracking open nuts and shearing vegetation and stuff like that. Next up we got Amblyocetus, which in general just seems to be, as a child, I thought the Amblyocetus was like some sort of crocodile or something like that, just because of how weird and non-mammalian it looked. Like, if we look here, it's got this very crocodile-esque jaw with very, very long, very, very toothy, no real signs of lips besides some very, very short ones. Really, really shrink-wrapped skull, very visible neck, along down a very non-mammal-like body, it seems. In contrast to the more accurate version here, that it kind of looks like a cross between a whale and an otter, kind of, looking at it. It definitely looks a lot more mammalian, and it's got a lot more, like, flubber on it and stuff than this one does. And there's also the setting, which is an issue. Ambulocetus was found in Pakistan, and most likely lived in the estuaries that were around that area, while the episode took place in Central Europe, Germany, I believe, which is a bit odd. The episode itself kind of acknowledged this because it said he was a stranger from the nearby coast, which implied that he was an ocean-going or brackish water hunter, which makes sense. I applaud him for doing that, but really, Pakistan all the way up to Central Europe. Moving on to Whale Killer. First thing we're going to look at is Basilosaurus, which in terms of design is one of my favorite from the Walking With series, and is also pretty accurate. There's not really any main issues I can fault with this. I know that some people have looked at the head shape and said that it looks more like a mosasaur than an actual whale, but to me, there's not really much of a difference, so just go and let that take up with them. But yeah, you're probably wondering why the Arc Basilosaurus is a picture in this one, and that's because it's actual, in terms of actual, like, gameplay mechanics, this actually fits Basilosaurus more than the Walking With one, because the Walking With one showed it as a very swift, open water hunter, which is not really the case. They've done studies on the vertebrae of Basilosaurus, and it has shown that Basilosaurus really wasn't designed to move at very fast speeds for long, and it also couldn't really dive that well. So it was a most fairly easygoing surface water hunter, essentially. Those zooms past the camera that you see it doing in some shots wouldn't really have happened, nor were they as agile swimming through the water as they were. Pretty graceful animals, but I doubt that graceful, as it were. Next up, we're going to move on to something that was pretty overlooked in Whale Killer, but I think it's something that's still worth bringing up, is the sharks. So they never really gave them a name in the show. Most people profit up to Physogalius here, which this is an illustration of. But this is the one I'm about to say here just goes within general sharks of the Kenozoic. So the Eocene sharks are represented by the Hybotus model. The Hybotus look here. I think they modified it slightly so that it doesn't have the, like, horn on... It doesn't have the spike on the fin, but that's besides the point. The sharks of the Eocene and most of the Kenozoic would have looked much more like the classic shark design that we know today, rather than this typical Hybotus look here. And that sort of thing in general with Kenozoic sharks. There were a few different shark forms that looked quite distinct from each other in the Mesozoic, the Hybodonts being one of them, along with the classic mackerel sharks and other modern sharks that we know of appearing in the Cretaceous period or so. However, by the time the KT mass extinction happened, these were the dominant sharks around. This dominant form, essentially. Sharks do obviously look different today, but I'm talking, you know a shark when you see one. And there's no shark today that looks quite like this, you know? So, yeah, probably looks something more like these depictions here than of the one here. Next up, Andrewsarchus, which is kind of interesting because of how obscure the species is in science, in general. It is pretty well known in Walking With. It sort of had its stardom there, but in terms of actual science, we really don't know that much about it. It's actually almost a mystery exactly what it even is. This right here is the only known bit of Andrewsarchus known, the top part of the jaw, which is this part here. It was Andrewsarchus meticulus first class as a Mesonychid, which were the first dominant group of carnivorous mammals to ever exist. There are 3 different main dominant carnivore mammals, which sort of went throughout the Cenozoic, one eventually like slowly replacing the other through time, but I'll talk about that later as we go further down. But yeah, the Mesonychid was the first of that trio, and they sort of gave it the Mesonychid body plan where it was sort of like an ungulate in relation, hence why they emphasized it being a literal sheep in wolf's clothing here, while still looking quite like a typical carnivore. However, we now know, at least to our best modern guess, Andrewsarchus still isn't really that closely related to most other mammalian groups, but they are closest to the Entelodons, which we will talk a bit more about later. But even then, it's not really an Entelodon itself, so that's... Andrewsarchus is quite unique in that regard to me. There's not really any other, like, big signature mammals I know of that are so distant in mammalian taxonomy or whatever, but that's the point. So, here's a more... This one is taking a little bit of liberties, I think. It's not really as close to Entelodonts that Andrewsarchus was closest related to, but it still wasn't an Entelodont, so I think that taking some liberties here is justified. But here's my favorite depiction of Andrewsarchus here. So, yeah, it looks quite a bit different from the original depiction here. So yeah. The other main issue is the place. The land portions of Whale Killer took place in Pakistan, while Andrewsarchus and Bolitherium, which we are going to talk about in the next slide, they both lived in Mongolia, not Pakistan. So, yeah. So here's Bolitherium, same thing. Lived in Mongolia, not Pakistan. And I feel like they did do quite a bit of shrink wrappage with the Bolitherium, not as much, because, you know, we do know general mammal proportions and stuff like that on big hood mammals, but I think this is more along the lines of what it actually look like, especially around the head area. It's a lot more, there's a lot more stuff on it than on the one here. So now we're moving on to land of giants. Then it was called Indricotherium, but now it's Paraceratherium. The name has shifted since then. But yeah, besides that, the actual look isn't terrible. It's quite accurate as far as I know. The main thing is with the name, as well as the statement of it being the largest land mammal ever. That's not really the case anymore. We have found a bigger mammal since Walking with Beasts. Here is Paleoloxodon, a species of elephant that lived in fairly recent times. It was around the same time that the Ice Age mammoths were roaming around the far north. These guys were in the more tropical areas of Africa and Asia. Europe as well. So yeah, Paleoloxodon is the biggest land mammal ever. Paraceratherium is in second, not too far behind, but still smaller. So now we're moving on to Hyaenodon. These guys scared the life out of me when I remember watching this episode. This episode in general is actually like probably the scariest out of the Walking with Beasts, because it's just in general how freaky the designs are. Like, look at this. This is terrifying here. The Hyaenodons have quite a hellhound look to them, as well as they have saber teeth for some reason. That's a trend they also see throughout Walking with Beasts, is they gave saber teeth to a lot of things which really shouldn't have saber teeth. So yeah, Hyaenodons, it does make sense that they don't exactly look like anything we have alive today, because Hyaenodons are not actually members of the same carnivore group as the members we have today. So there's essentially three main, like I said before, there's 3 main groups of carnivorous mammals that sort of one replace the other through the Cenozoic period, the Cenozoic era. The first one was the Mesonychids, which I talked about, which Andrewsarchus was thought to be, but not really anymore. The second one is the Creodonts, which Entelodon is. Entelodon is a part of that family. And then the Carnivorans, which is a family that consists of practically all modern carnivorous mammals. The pinnipeds, the bears, the dogs, the cats, the hyenas, everything in that nature. So, yeah, it sort of makes sense they don't look exactly like them, but they still would have looked somewhat like a mammal. Like this illustration here shows. This is a far more accurate Hyaenodon, I feel, along with these two at the bottom here. So, it's a lot less dramatic than what they got going here. And then there's also the size. They said in the documentary that they were as big as rhinos, which is not necessarily true. The largest Hyaenodon got to around the size of a lion, and that's about it. They never really got bigger than that. So yeah, they were still big. They were still quite huge, quite frankly, but they never got rhino-sized. So now moving on to Cynodictys. So this is the first carnivoran that we actually see. This episode also has the trend of not really giving as much hair to mammals that really need it. The Hyaenodon was one of the main examples of that, along with the Entelodon that we're going to see later, as well as Cynodictys here, or as it was called in the episode, the bear dog. It should really have like a little bit more hair on it rather than this really, really, really thin coat. As well as the fact that it has this really, really thin tail, which is a kind of ridiculous considering that if we look at modern foxes, they have ridiculously thin tails, but it's all floofy. So odds are Cynodictys had something more along the lines of that. This is a more accurate illustration of what Cynodictys looked like here. And another thing about it is that Cynodictys should already be extinct. Cynodictys lived during the early Oligocene, around 30 million years ago, and the episode takes place in the Oligocene, about 5 million years after that. So yeah, these guys should already be extinct by now. Now moving on to the Entelodon, which is, I think it might be my personal favorite creature in the episode, simply because of how well they executed it with how terrifying and brutish they are. But yeah, although they're probably my favorite, probably one of the most well executed species in the show, they are probably some of the least accurate. They look very, very, very grotesque and demonic compared to how they actually appear in life. Here's an illustration by Julio Lacerda, which you will see quite a bit of him as we move on later on into the discussion. So, yeah, look more along the lines of this. It's quite a bit more like pig-like, even though Entelodon, I want to emphasize this, Entelodons are not pigs. They're a completely different family of hood mammals. But, yeah, it definitely looks a lot more like you'd actually imagine a mammal looking like this, in contrast to like this. Once again, quite hairless, very, very shrink wrapped around the face area, along with, well, the general body. And while Entelodonts did live during the late Oligocene, Entelodon itself, not really. Entelodon was one of the earlier species. It should already be extinct by now, like the Cynodictys. It became extinct during the early Oligocene, about 10 million years or so before that. So there's not really that much of an issue with next of kin, but there are some very, very, very slight discrepancies I'd like to make. One of them being Dinophilis, which the only issue I could find with it was more along the lines of its saber teeth. The rat-like tail is also a bit but I'm gonna let that slide. The main thing is the saber teeth. Dinophilis is what we call a false saber-toothed cat, in that it wasn't exactly an actual saber-toothed cat. It wasn't part of that family. But it did also evolve its own form of fairly large saber teeth. But Dinophilis did not really have them as pronounced as in the actual saber-toothed cats. As you can see here, this is an illustration of a Dinophilis skull here. And as you can see, they aren't really large enough to warrant them actually like appearing outside of the mouth. To me, it's still quite apparent that they would fit inside the lips and such, so I find it odd that they have blatant saber teeth here. They aren't really large enough to really demand that. And finally, we got Dinotherium, which is, again, one of the largest land mammals ever. Maybe not as big as Paraceratherium or Paleoloxodon or some others, but it was still gigantic. And the only issue I got with it is its trunk, which seems quite a bit short. This is something fairly popular in Dinotherium illustrations, which I really don't understand why that makes sense. Why wouldn't it really have a long one? Because this is a tall, gigantic animal. It bending down to drink would be sort of an issue, wouldn't it? Wouldn't it? It seems a bit, like, contradictory for it to have a short trunk for seemingly no reason. I mean, maybe they thought of this because they thought the distinctive backward-facing tusks that Dinotheres, that's a subfamily of elephants with these backward-facing tusks. Maybe they thought that if they have a longer trunk, that end up getting in the way of these, but I really don't think that'd be an issue. It really should have a longer trunk. Alright, so now we're moving on to Smilodon and the entire Sabretooth episode, which, similar to the Ornithocheirus episode, really shouldn't have happened at all. Because while it was easily one of the best storylines of the entire Walking with Beasts documentary, it is also one of the least original. The Smilodon in that are literally just lions. They're literally just lions. They have a pride structure. The entire story focuses around this pride structure. The males are literally bigger and got manes and such, which, as I'm about to talk about, is not really the case. Looking at the many different specimens of Smilodon, both male and female, there isn't really any sexual dimorphism at all between the sexes. So, odds are, I don't know what sort of social structure they have, that's still up to debate, but quite frankly, pride structure, not really the case. Anything but prides, basically, is all I'm saying. Ironically, I'm about to go from saying they're not really like lions to saying they might have looked kind of like lions. So, there was a study done to try and pinpoint an association between environment and coloration, which would help with figuring out the coloration of various extinct cat species like Smilodon, and the study actually showed that there is a correlation between environment and what the animals looked like. Cats that lived in forest environments had usually some sort of pattern, whether it be spots or stripes, while ones that lived in more open plains environments tended to be plain, to sort of match the dry grasses and such. So here's the South American species of Smilodon here, portrayed with a fairly accurate plain coloration here, in contrast to the North American species here, which is shown alongside the South American counterpart. South American species Smilodon populador is the one seen in Walking with Dinosaurs, while the North American species Smilodon fatalis lived in a more shrubbery, somewhat more forest environment, hence why it was probably given a more spotted coloration here, much like the ones in the show here, but odds are they would have had a lot more plain rather than spotted. And finally, the hunt sequence in that is also something that raises a bit of flags, because Smilodon were not pursuit predators like lions. They could not really chase for that far distances. They were very big, muscular cats, so they didn't really have the stamina in order to chase prey from remotely long distances like lions would or cheetahs would. So they relied on ambushing their prey. So now we're going on to Forus rhacus, which has two main issues. The first of these is the claw that the Forus rhacus presents. You don't really see it as much in the actual show, but it really is visible on these promo images like you see here. This mostly stems from a theory that was going around at the time about how there was this one fairly distinct finger bone on the wings of Forus rhacus, like Forus rhacus, and that proposed a theory that they would have had like a claw in life that they would have used for some purpose, whether it be grabbing onto prey or in fights with each other or things like that. But it was fairly quickly discredited because the terror bird's modern relatives, the Seriimas, they also have the exact same claw in their wing, and they don't have actual talons or finger claws. So odds are terror birds didn't have it either. This is a more accurate portrayal of a Forus rhacus here without the claw. And the other issue is that they really should have been extinct by now. Forus rhacus lived throughout all of the Cenozoic. However, the episode Sabretooth takes place during the Pleistocene, around 1 million years ago, when Forus rhacus itself lived during the Miocene, around 15 to 10 million years ago, around that range, so it alone should already be extinct. And terror birds in general went extinct during the Pliocene about 2 million years ago, so the Terabirds should have already been out by this point. Next up is Macrauchenia, which I didn't actually realize that it had some issues until actually researching for this episode. So Macrauchenia, the two main issues are, first of all, it's like general like anatomy and size wise. Macrauchenia is shown being a fairly lean gazelle-like animal, in contrast to the more bulky animals that you see here. Macrauchenian life could have easily have gotten over a ton, so they were not simply pushovers to Smilodon. They could have gave at least one by itself a good run for its money if the Smilodon wasn't careful. And the other issue is the nose. So yes, this may come as a surprise to a lot of people, but Macrauchenia did not actually have a trunk. This comes from a misconception from the nasal in its skull. They thought it suggested that it would have supported a trunk, when in reality it shows that it would have supported a more chambered nose structure, more similar to a Psychoantelope than a taper here. So next up is Megatherium, which for the most part is accurate. I love how these guys are portrayed in the show, these somewhat unmatchable tanks, which is appropriate considering how giant and powerful these guys actually were. But the only issue with these guys is the omnivorous lifestyle. It was once again a theory that was going around at the time that they could have potentially have been omnivorous, but we now know, because God knows how many dung deposits we have found in Megatherium and various other ground slots. They've really shown no evidence of omnivory or carnivory at all. They were purely herbivores. So now we're moving on to the final episode, Mammoth's Journey, which is fairly accurate. A majority of it is, which I'd hope so. It's one of the most recent time periods in our history, so odds are we know about this more than the God knows how many millions of years back we've gone from this point. But yeah, there's only two main issues. The first one is with the cave lion, or it should be more appropriately called the steppe lion, because we now know the cave lions, as we call them, they never really lived in caves or really went in them all that much. We have found a lot of cave lion bones in caves, and that's because during the winter time they'd hunt the cave bears that were hibernating in the caves, and sometimes they ended up accidentally killing themselves because they picked on more than they could chew in a situation against the bears when they went in to hunt the bears that were sleeping. So yeah, a more appropriate term is steppe lion rather than cave lion, but that's besides the point. So the cave lion in Walking with Beasts is very, very white, almost polar bear-like, and it also has saber teeth. It's not really shown in this picture, but I have seen other pictures which made me notice it has saber teeth, which I only just noticed upon making this video. But yeah, that's kind of ridiculous. They really shouldn't have saber teeth. But yeah, cave lions in life looked quite similar to modern African lions. There's only like two main differences. The first one is they had a much less pronounced mane, which the episode portrayed quite accurately. They never really had a mane, which is appropriate, I guess. If the males had a mane, then it definitely wasn't as pronounced as the African lion's mane. And they also were most likely more brown in coloration, almost like a puma or mountain lion, rather than the very light brown color of the African savanna. It would have helped them blend in more with the forested areas that they lived in. So now the last part with Walking with Beasts is the Neanderthals, which, while portrayed fairly accurately, they should have already been extinct by the time the episode took place. The episode took place around 30,000 years ago, when Neanderthals went extinct about 10,000 years earlier, 40,000 years ago. So they should have already been extinct. The episode does make it clear that they were already on their way out, saying that they were an endangered species and such, but still, they should have already been gone by this point. They could have just changed it up to be like 45,000 years ago or so, and it literally wouldn't have changed anything with how the episode went, as far as I know, and it would have fixed this issue. But yeah. Alright, so now moving on to Land of Giants. Again, 2 episodes in the Walking With series are called Land of Giants, don't ask me why. But, yeah, the Land of Giants does have the Giga effect. Hell, this is what gave it its name, because the animals found throughout all of this, throughout the entire episode, are so scattered, time and place-wise, that it's rather ridiculous. So, the Giganotosaurus, Macrogryphosaurus, Argentinosaurus, and Sarcosuchus are somewhat place-appropriate, but time-wise, they're very, very scattered, and don't even get me started on the pterosaurs. So, Sarcosuchus and Ornithocheirus lived much earlier, around 115 and 120 million years ago, in the Aptian, and then you got the episode takes place during the very, very early Cenomanian, around 100 million years ago, which is the time and place that Giga lived. Giga is the only one actually appropriate for the episode. Macrogryphosaurus and Argentinosaurus didn't appear until later on in the Cenomanian, when Giga was already extinct. So, yes, Giganotosaurus and Argentinosaurus never actually met, but I'll talk about that later. But yeah, they lived later in the Cenomanian, around 95 million years ago. And then you got Pteranodon, which lived up in North America, not South America, and it lived during the Suetonian, or the heck it's spelled here. Yeah, it's Suetonian, okay. Around 85 million years ago, and then there's Ornithocheirus, which was European. Very, very scattered, the animals of this time and place. So yeah, we got Giganotosaurus, which, although it was emphasized to be the biggest land predator ever, that might not really be correct, considering that mass-wise, both Carcharodontosaurus and Tyrannosaurus both beat it in terms of sheer mass, and in terms of length, Spinosaurus also beats it. But then again, you might not consider Spinosaurus to be a terrestrial predator, so we'll just ignore that. So yeah, looking at this guy, he does have the typical theropod problems with the pronate hands, and also his skull is also a little bit iffy. It is very, very, like, once again, it's kind of shrink-wrapped. You can still see the 3 noticeable holes here in the grooves, which is the actual bone between the holes, in contrast to it actually having, like, meat on it, where it's very, very long and smooth, the entire skull, in contrast to this one here, which seems quite shorter, and also almost like triangular shaped in a sense. And then, yeah, we got Argentinosaurus. So, looking at it, it's got the same horizontal neck issue, when in reality it should have been a bit more like half horizontal, half vertical. And also, I'm just going to discuss the Argentinosaurus Giga relationship here, which is not necessarily correct, because once again, they lived in 2 different times. Argentinosaurus had Mapusaurus to worry about. It was Giganotosaurus' very close relative, but they are still a completely different genus, basically. So, Giganotosaurus did not coexist alongside Argentinosaurus at all. Argentinosaurus lived alongside other species like Rabachisaurus, I believe, and other similar, smaller sauropods. And then we got Macrogryphosaurus, which was called Iguanodon because at the time Iguanodon was thought to be global. They even acknowledged this in the episode, which is not necessarily true anymore. So yeah, it was very, very Iguanodon like in the episode, in contrast to what we now know about it. Macrogryphosaurus is a basal Iguanodon like Dryosaurus, so odds are it looked a bit more like that, being purely bipedal and very, very Dryosaur-like here. Maybe it had feathers, but I don't know. They might have, like, been out of it at this point. Who knows? Alright, so Pteranodon. Pteranodon, along being with the shouldn't have even been there and shouldn't have evolved yet, also had the very typical pterosaur issues. The very, very pointed wings, the lack of pectinofibers, and yeah, that's about it. I do appreciate that this picture shows the sexual dimorphism that Pteranodon had. Males were about double the size of females in Pteranodon, little fun fact. Alright, so now we're moving on to the giant claw, which also suffers from the Giga effect. So the only ones that were everything did live in the general area, but there was a bit of a discrepancy in the time periods. So the episode takes place during the Campanian, 75 million years ago, while Azdraco here, the pterosaur that you occasionally see in the background, lived during the Turritonian, around 80, 90, 85 million years ago or so, around that region. While Therizinosaurus, Mononychus, Coelophysis, and Tarbosaurus lived during the Maastrichtian. They were the guys that lived in China when T-Rex was roaming the lands of North America around 66 million years ago. So yeah, Sauropod. The main issue to be had with this guy is the general skull shape. It is simply an edited Anatotitan model, so it has a very, very similar head shape, while its head was actually quite distinct from Edmontosaurus, where it had like quite a bulbous back, but the skull actually started to like thin out drastically as it got closer to the bill, as you can see here. This is an illustration by John Conway of a Tarbosaurus hunting a Sauropod, just in case you're curious. But yeah, Velociraptor. So I do like how these guys are depicted in the episode. They have like this very ominous soundtrack that accompanies them, and they also are shown to be small, quick, and their general anatomy is alright. It's not the Jurassic Park raptors, I'm just gonna say that. But they did have the pronated hands, and they also did completely lack feathers, which we know for a fact Velociraptor had because of the quill knobs on the arms that we found. They were definitely feathered Velociraptors. But yeah, the other thing that's an issue is how they were shown hunting. At the time, it was thought that a raptor's sickle claws were used for making giant wounds and sort of like slashing into prey, similar to how Jurassic Park kind of told people, but that's not necessarily the case at all. So the most common consensus currently on how raptors hunted is currently a method called raptor prey restraint, where essentially they jump up in the air, possibly flapping their wings in order to gain greater height, or gain some extra momentum in their jump. They latch onto the prey feet first, similar to how modern birds of prey attack, and then they use their wings to sort of stabilize themselves and make sure they don't fall over, while they lean over with their jaws in order to do the actual damage. So their sickle claws are used more to simply hold on and grapple with the prey rather than actually do the damage, which the claws and the teeth would do that mostly. The hand claws and the teeth would mostly do that form of damage. And I found it very odd that they actually went down that route in the giant claw, because the Utahraptors in the original Walking with Dinosaurs documentary, they were portrayed hunting fairly accurately. They simply sunk their sickle claws into the hide of the animal in order to hold on while they went for the throat. That was pretty accurate, in contrast to the Velociraptors in here, which sort of did a single slash with their sickle claw before backing off, and sort of did a couple of times until it fell over, which, not really accurate again. So yeah, this is why people tend to call them giant groundhogs, because the general consensus on how they hunted is quite similar to how modern raptors hunt, except on the ground. So yeah, Mononychus, the main issue with Mononychus is just, although I do give them credit for actually having feathers on this dinosaur, they didn't really add enough feathers. It should be a lot more fully feathered, as we know most Allosaurs were anyway, in contrast to the one in Walking with Dinosaurs, which only really had feathers around the torso area. So now moving on to Tarbosaurus, which I think in comparison to the T-Rex from Walking with Dinosaurs is absolutely amazing. I think they did much better than Walking with Dinosaurs Rex. This is how Rex should have looked like, but that's besides the point. So yeah, the main beef with this guy is once again the general shrink wrapping and pronated hands. You can see it here in the main profile picture. Pronated hands, they should be facing each other rather than towards the ground. And also the skull and general body is once again quite shrink wrapped. You can once again see the 3 holes here somewhat in the skull, in contrast to what the animal in life, which would have looked like this. Another thing interesting about Tarbosaurus is we have, like, integument preservation of the throat area, which shows that it might have had a wattle or throat sac. So the picture here shows it with like a turkey-like wattle, which may or may not be what it actually had. We don't know. All that we know is that it had some form of structure there, whether it be a wattle or a neck sac or something like that, which Tarbosaurus in the episode did not have. And then we got Azteko, which should already be extinct. First of all, but it also still suffers from the same pterosaur issues with the very, very pointed wingtips and also pycnofibers. The general proportions are also quite a bit off, and this is something I forgot to talk about with the Quetzalcoatlus in Book of Dinosaurs. Azterkids, which is the family that Azteko and Quetzalcoatlus are in, they had a much different body plan than the typical pterodactyloid pterosaurs. This is a typical pterodactyloid pterosaur look here, with the short neck, medium-sized head, mainly large body, and very big wingspan, which is quite a bit different from the Azterkid body plan here, with a giant head, fairly long neck, and large body and shorter wings, which is how that's the general body plan that Quetzalcoatlus and Azteko actually had. They didn't really have the pterodactyloid body plan that Pteranodon and other species had. Alright, so next up, there's Untisaurus. Well, this guy's got the same general theropod issues. Lack of general feathers, as well as being able to pronate their hands. It doesn't really have them pronate in this shot, but it does have them pronate their hands in several shots in the actual documentary. Alright, so moving on to Chased by Sea Monsters, the first thing that we're going to talk about is plant life. Because the first segment of Chased by Sea Monsters, the Ordovician, it tries to emphasize how on land there was pretty much no life yet. That was visible anyway. Plants haven't evolved yet, apparently, and stuff like that, and that's not really true. In fact, the Ordovician is when plants actually came to the land, in the form of non-vascular plants like moss and lichen. This scene here might be commonplace throughout a good portion of the Ordovician, and wouldn't have been just plain vast emptiness all over. And then there's also Chimerosaurus, which is one of the biggest orthocones ever, and was the main one portrayed in the segment. So the main issue with it is its size here. Is in the show they portrayed it as being around 9 meters in length, or 30 feet, but in actuality it didn't really get past 20 feet or 6 meters. It was quite a bit smaller than the gigantic individual that we saw in the segment. Moving on to the Triassic segment here, which took place in Europe around 230 million years ago, we have a couple of characters from New Blood who make reappearances. We have the Peteinosaurus, which is actually in the accurate place now. We're in Europe, so Peteinosaurus here isn't too bad, but now we're a bit too early. 230 million years ago, Peteinosaurus wouldn't have evolved yet. Same goes with Coelophysis. The same issue with it before, it's too early. It's still got some of the same shrink wrapping issues, and it also is now in Europe for some reason. It was accurate in North America, but now that it's in Europe, it's a bit... no, it's not European, it's American. So moving on to Nothosaurus. Although the time and place is accurate, its general appearance is a bit shrink wrapped. The head is very noticeable on the body, and in general it just seems like everything is very, very, like, noticeable on it. In contrast to this, what looks like a painting here, but I'm not an art person, so I wouldn't really know. But yeah, the Nothosaurus here look a lot more like focused to marine rather than the very, very wrinkly one that we got in Chased by Sea Monsters. And then we got Tenistrophius, which is probably diverged the most since Chased by Sea Monsters was aired back in, I believe it was 2002 or 2003, somewhere around there. And Tenistrophius in that was depicted as being aquatic, and I believe that this is mostly because they thought something with a neck that was like 2/3 the length of its body wouldn't have been able to support that on land, but as it turns out it actually could. Tenistrophius was a land animal. It was coastal though, it fed on fish near the shore, but it was not aquatic, like the Tanystropheus in Chased by Sea Monsters was. And it also couldn't detach its tail like a lizard. Tanystropheus may have been a reptile like a lizard, but it was not a lizard itself. It couldn't just detach the tail whenever it wanted like a lizard could. Moving on to Dunkleosteus, its general appearance is not bad. I like that they sort of toned down its armor to where, unless you actually looked for it, it isn't really that visible, in contrast to some of the really armor-fied Dunkleosteus I've seen, like with the ARC version of Dunkleosteus. But yeah, the main issue, again, similar to Chimaerosaurus, is its size. It was said in the Devonian segment to be around 9 meters in length, when in reality 6 meters is a much more appropriate size for Dunkleosteus. As far as I know, no placoderm actually got to 9 meters. The closest was Titanichthys, which was a placoderm bigger than Dunkleosteus, and it was only slightly bigger than Dunkle. It was more bulky, definitely, but in terms of length, it was only slightly longer. So now we got Stetthocanthus, which were portrayed as some of the first sharks, but in reality, Stetthocanthus are not sharks. They're part of a different family of cartilaginous fish, which are now extinct, but their closest relatives are not sharks. They're actually the living chimera, or ratfish. And that's also the case for another famous shark, quote-unquote, Helicoprion. Helicoprion and Stetthocanthus were not in the same family, but they were relatives of each other, and Helicoprion was in the same boat as Stetthocanthus in a sense. Completely different family, but same scenario. Completely different family, was closer related to ratfish and chimera rather than sharks. So yeah, there's that. They aren't actually sharks. And another thing to note is that they were quite oversized in Chased by Sea Monsters. They were shown to be around the size of a person, around 6 feet or 2 meters in length, when the biggest individual only got to around 1 meter in length. I don't know why this shows it here that these guys are like double the size of what they should be, but yeah, it was around 1 meter long here. Alright, we're completely skipping the Eocene segment, because that was essentially just walking with beasts all over again. There really isn't anything new to touch up on that. But I just want to talk about Megalodon really quickly, because this will literally be the only time in Mistaken Truths, aside from one other time with Jurassic Fight Club later on, that will actually talk about Megalodon. But I just want to talk about the misnomer about how Megalodon was not just an oversized great white. It was quite different, both in terms of how it lived and in terms of actual like genetics and family. So essentially, I might as well talk about the great white shark first before talking about Megalodon. The great white shark is a member of the mackerel shark family, which also consists of sharks such as the mako shark and the bull shark and other shark species like that. The basking shark too, which is huge, could get up to like 12 meters in length, I believe. But Megalodon was not a mackerel shark. It was originally thought that Megalodon was a very close relative, or potentially the ancestor of the great white shark, but now we know that's not quite the case. Megalodon, or how it's actually called, Caulkicephalus Megalodon, was actually the last of a family called the Otodontids, or as I like to call them, the megatooth sharks. These sharks first appeared during the late Cretaceous, but once the KT hit and all the big marine reptiles like the mosasaurs were gone, they essentially became the new king of the oceans. There were a couple of whales that rivaled them, but in general, these guys were the top dogs of the sea before Megalodon in particular became extinct. Megalodon was the last and the biggest, but they were a whole family. There were other giant mega sharks that roamed the ocean besides Megalodon. One of the most well-known ones being Otodus, which got to around 9 meters here. So, still a gigantic shark. But Megalodon was the biggest and the last of the family here, so odds are, while it probably still kind of looked like a great white, I mean, for all we know, it still had a body plan similar to mackerel sharks, but it still wouldn't have been just a giant great white scaled up, you know? Oh, and one other thing to talk about is this one segment with the metal cage. I know that they tried to emphasize that since the cage is round like a ball, big animals would have a hard time actually biting onto that, but I don't really know how that'd work, because the bars give something for the teeth to grip onto, so I don't really know how that works. Not only that, but Megalodon also has one of the most powerful bite forces of any animal, period. Capable of biting down with up to 20 tons per square inch, or potentially that much, 15 to 20 tons about. That is easily 4 to 5 times greater than the bite force of a T-Rex. It is tremendous. This metal cage would not stand a chance against the bite of a Megalodon. Absolutely not. There was especially one scene where the Megalodon was visually just biting at the cage, but it didn't really do anything. That is not the case. That cage would be done. It would be dead. Completely. Wasted. Nigel would be done. Nigel would be donezo. Alright, so moving on to the Jurassic section. Most of it is just Cruel Seas Redux, so I'm not going to talk about most of it. But there is this new character in the form of Leadsichthys, which was a giant bony fish that essentially filter fed. And in the segment, they were shown to be pretty much blue whale sized, 90 to 100 feet in length. And that is not really the case. Most individuals were around 9 meters or 30 feet, and the biggest individuals, if we are to stretch out the size scale a bit, were 15 to 18 meters, and that's maximum, and those individuals were few and far between. So much, much smaller than the one seen in Chased by Sea Monsters. Moving on to the Cretaceous, we're going on with Hesperornis, which it seems like a very dinosaurified bird. It's got feathers, but they're like very, very restricted on the body, and it's also got this naked dinosaurian-looking head. When in reality, it probably looked much more like modern grebes and loons and stuff like that. Very much like a bird. Maybe not the birds that we have today, because, you know, birds with teeth. But yeah, they still would have looked somewhat like birds instead of very, very weird-looking dinosaur birds, kinda. Okay, so Squalicorex, which we saw briefly during the Feeding Frenzy segment with the Megalodon model. And it's essentially the same thing. It probably didn't look exactly like a great white. This is a more accurate depiction of a Squalicorex here. It's still very much like a modern-looking shark, but it's not a great white clone. So now we're going to talk about Mosasaurus for a brief minute, because this is something that Chased by Sea Monsters, I admit they tried to do something different with them, but science sort of said no to that. So there were two different species of Mosasaur that appeared in the show, one of them being Halesaurus, which is a smaller coastal species, only got to around 4 meters in length, and then we got the giant Mosasaurs, which in the episode were Tylosaurus. So what I'm going to talk about briefly with Mosasaur coloration involves both of these guys, is while I do like their patterns, they may not entirely be accurate, because we know from impressions of pigment in certain areas of the body that have been found, we know that Mosasaurs did have counter shading, or black on top, white on bottom, like modern open water sharks like the great white. So I'm not exactly sure how accurate these actual coloration patterns are on these animals. And then there's also there's also two other things which involve Tylosaurus in particular. The first one is its size. They were shown to be gigantic in Chased by Sea Monsters, like 18 meters in length or so, which is absolutely huge for both Mosasaurs in general and Tylosaurus. Tylosaurus and Mosasaurus are the two of the biggest species of Mosasaur, but both of them never got over 12 meters or so, really. 12 meters was the max for the species. No Mosasaur ever got to 18 meters at all. 12 meters was the maximum size range. And then they also did something... I do applaud them for thinking outside the box and making them different than what typical depictions show, but they made Tylosaurus into pod animals, essentially, when in reality fossils clearly show that it's very, very common that individuals of the same species would fight and potentially kill and eat each other. Because of God knows how many smaller mosasaurs have been found in the stomachs of other mosasaurs, and the tooth marks of other mosasaurs, which are probably from the same species given the size of them, found on the skulls of mosasaurs. So, yeah, very, very violent animals. In Chased by Sea Monsters, Tyrannosaurus also makes a very, very random cameo. Even as a kid watching this, I thought it was oddly random for them to just show T-Rex triumphantly roaring out into the sea while a Pteranodon flying overhead gets swooped by it and flies upwards. Yeah, the episode takes place during the Campanian, 75 million years ago, which would not be the time T-Rex lived. T-Rex would not have evolved yet. This was the time that Gorgosaurus, Thespletosaurus, and Albertosaurus were running around, T-Rex's ancestors. They were running around this time, but not T-Rex. T-Rex would not have been around yet. And then there's Archelon, which although it looks alright, it's anatomically not bad. The main issue I have with it is how they portray it essentially being fodder for Mosasaurus, which is not true. It is correct that they did not have a true shell, similar to the leatherback sea turtle today, where it was more along the lines of very, very thick, leathery skin, rather than an actual shell. But that still would have been enough to deter Mosasaurs. Forget how inaccurate the Mosasaur looks in this picture, but this is fairly accurate here. If a Mosasaur actually bit down on an Archelon, it would not break it in half. It would not tear it apart. It really wouldn't do anything. The sheer size of the Archelon and how thick the skin would be enough to where it'd be pretty much impossible for a Mosasaur to actually kill an Archelon unless it got at the head and the extremity fins and tail, which we do know they did occasionally, because it's actually very rare to find an Archelon without one or maybe even two flippers missing from Mosasaur attacks. But yeah, split right in half, no, not really. No Mosasaur could actually do that to an Archelon. So now we got Elasmosaurus, which has more along the lines of a classic case of shrink wrapping. The head is very, very clearly bulbous-like on the tip of the very, very long, thin neck. And the body is also very, 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 box-like. You can see, the edge of the rib cage here and the shoulder and stuff like that, and it's a bit, in contrast to, how the actual body was, where it was a lot more circular, and you have these very long, powerful flippers, and the very long neck with the smallish head on the bottom. And it also, like all Plesiosaurus, had a tail fluke at the end of the tail. So we're finally nearing the end of our very long journey with walking with monsters. So here we have Anomalocaris, which although it looks alright, it looks pretty great actually, the main issue with it is its size. They said it was around 2 meters in length, which is inaccurate. The biggest Anomalocaris only got to about half that size. They were fairly small. Although I applaud that they actually did make them look absolutely huge in the Cambrian segment, which is what they were going for. So the Silurian segment is very, very odd because it didn't actually take place in the Silurian. 418 million years ago is the early Devonian. So I don't know why they said the very, very early Devonian. If it was 5 million years earlier, it would have been in the Silurian like it should be. But instead of being in the Silurian, it's actually the late Devonian. The early Devonian, I mean. So, yeah, that's a mistake. Chimaerosaurus makes a reappearance in here, and it's actually appropriately sized, too. They said it was 6 meters in length, which is appropriate. That's actually accurate. They fixed that since Chased by Sea Monsters. But now it should already be extinct by now. We're out of the Ordovician. We're in the early Devonian now. So, yeah, Orthocones are still around, but not Chimaerosaurus. He or she should already be extinct by now. So now we're going on to Pterygotus, which looks alright, but it does have an issue with its size. They said it was around 3 meters in length, which Pterygotus did not get that big. And neither did any arthropod ever, actually. The Pterygotus itself only got to about half that length in 2 meters or 6 feet in length. And the biggest arthropod we know of, both Arthropleurodon and Jaculopterus, another larger Eurypterid, both of them were around 8 feet or 2.5 meters in length. So no arthropod actually got to 3 meters. That is far too large. So now moving on to Hyneria, which, once again, looks alright, but it's just another sizing issue. Oh, speaking of which, I might as well talk about Steprocanthus being in fresh water real quick. As far as I know, that isn't really correct. They were an ocean-going species, but now moving on from that, Hyneria, although it looks alright, is once again a size issue. Hyneria was shown in the show to be around 5, it's either 5 or 6 meters, depending on what version you're watching. I've heard both, but yeah, that is way too large for a Hyneria. The largest one's got to around 8 feet in length, or 2.5 meters, so around half that size, and even more so. So now this whole thing with the Mesothelae, or the giant spider. So this is actually a very interesting story. So this picture here, back in around, it was found around a couple of months, or maybe even a year or so, before Walking with Monsters was made, but back then they thought they found a giant species of spider, and it's dubbed Megarachne. At the time, it was thought to be the largest spider to ever live. It was absolutely huge. But in 2005, they actually found a more complete specimen, and they found out it wasn't a spider at all. It was actually a land Eurypterid. So this is what it actually looked like in life. Looking at it, I can actually see the spider-like resemblance here. Here's the body, and here's the thorax bit at the end. The abdomen, I mean. The abdomen part here. And you can sort of see that same part right here. So you can sort of see how they thought it was a giant spider. And at the time of this discovery, that it was actually a land Eurypterid, Walking with Monsters was pretty much finished, but it hadn't come out yet. So they were like, "Oh God, what are we supposed to do? We can't turn back on this now. The main focus of the segment is already a giant spider. We can't change that. It's too far in production." So the only thing that they could really do is just change it to where it was a generic giant Mesothelae spider rather than Megarachne in particular. And yeah, even then, it's obviously inaccurate, but it's not really their fault. But there was no giant spiders during the Carboniferous at all. So don't worry, that giant spider that haunts your nightmares, it doesn't exist really. And then there's Meganeura, which, although it's appropriately sized and it's shown like being a big aerial hunters, it is in the wrong place. The Carboniferous segment takes place in North America, Kansas to be specific, but Meganeura is purely European. It's a European species. So Walking with Monsters does have these evolution segments, and I do like them. They're great. But there are a couple which do raise a couple of flags. One of them being the Petrolacosaurus to Edaphosaurus, which is not really true because of how reptile evolution works. So here's a little bit of a lesson. There are 3 main groups of land-dwelling animals. There are the anapsids, the diapsids, and the synapsids. So over here we got the anapsids, which today are mostly represented by turtles. And these guys have one hole behind the... These guys have no hole behind the eye socket. Diapsids include most modern reptiles, such as lizards, crocodiles, the dinosaurs, the birds, everything of that nature. They have 2 holes behind the skull, and then there's the synapsids, with only 1 hole behind the skull, which today are purely represented in mammals. So all of these guys diverged from a common ancestor in some point in reptile evolution. It did not go from anapsid to diapsid or synapsid, or diapsid to synapsid, and things like that. So you can see the issue when a diapsid, a Petrolacosaurus, evolves into a synapsid, like Edaphosaurus. So yeah, that's not entirely accurate. So now the early Permian also has a sort of Giga effect, because the segment took place during the Kungurian 275 million years ago. However, this wasn't really the best time to do it. If they did around 10 million years earlier, in the Artidskian, it would have been better, because this is the time that Edaphosaurus lived in. By the time that the Dimetrodon segment came around, Edaphosaurus was already extinct. Like 285 million years ago, Edaphosaurus, Samoria, and Dimetrodon did all live. together in the same time and place, as you can see here. But around 10 million years after that, while say Moria and Dimetrodon were still around, Dilophosaurus was not. It was already extinct. So that's unfortunate. So now we're going to talk a little bit about Dimetrodon itself. There are a couple of smaller issues which altogether group up into one bigger issue. So, looking at the general body of Dimetrodon, it's in general alright on both, but the Dimetrodon in Walking with Monsters has a very long monolizard-like tail, which is quite different from how we now know Dimetrodon actually had a fairly... For its body size, it had quite the short tail. It was fairly small. And another thing about Dimetrodon we know is with its big sail, is that the ends of the vertebrae were actually somewhat free. They were not combined with webbing like 90% of the other length of the vertebrae. So it had this very like prickly or pringled appearance to its sail, in contrast to the Walking with Monsters one, which is just sail all around. And then there was also the part with the babies. They were shown to be pretty much clones of their parents, which is not the case. Dimetrodon, when they were young, looked quite a bit different from the adults. And yeah, similar to this Diapsid to Synapsid evolution segment, we also got Dimetrodon to Gorgonopsid, which once again is not necessarily correct. Dimetrodon, in particular, was part of a family called the Polacanthus, which, while they were synapsids or stem mammals, as a proper term, mammal-like reptiles is sort of a misnomer. Stem mammals is a much better term because they were much closer to mammals than they were to actual reptiles. But even then, Pelagosaurs were an synapsid offshoot that never really got anywhere after the sailbacks. So they were an evolutionary dead end basically. While Gorgonopsid is much closer to the mammal lineage, and the close relatives of Gorgonopsids, the Cynodonts, are what eventually evolved into mammals. But yeah, so you can see why Dimetrodon evolving into Gorgonopsid is a bit iffy. So yeah, the Giga effect with the late Permian. And the funny part is, similar to the not Silurian segment, this segment didn't even really take place during the late Permian. 250 million years ago was the early Triassic. The Great Dying already happened by the time this segment took place. 252 million years ago was the Great Extinction event that killed 95% of all life on Earth. But yeah, if we're just going to ignore that and say that this took place at around the same time the Great Dying happened, then only Scutosaurus would have been appropriate, because the Gorgonopsid that was shown in the episode, along with Dakotadon and Rhinosuchus, they lived quite a bit earlier. The Gorgonopsid and Dakotadon lived about 5 to 10 million years earlier, and Rhinosuchus was a lot earlier than that. All these guys would have already been extinct by the time the Great Dying happened. And not only that, but the segment also takes place in Russia, Siberia, and only Scutosaurus lived there. The Gorgonopsid, Rhinosuchus, and Dakotadon are all South African. So I don't know why they specifically did that. But yeah. So now we're going to talk about Gorgonops. And there is a bit of debate over exactly what species of Gorgonopsid the Gorgonopsid in the episode is. But I'm going by what I officially know. I have the main Walking with Dinosaurs book, and it says that the species shown in Walking with Monsters is Gorgonops, and not Eustreptospondylus, which is the largest Gorgonopsid. That would have made more sense, because that one actually lived in Siberia with Scutosaurus. But yeah, the episode is Gorgonops, so that's what we're going to go with. So not only was it South African and lived earlier than Scutosaurus, but it also is quite a bit. It's massive compared to what Gorgonops actually was. Gorgonops in real life was around the size of a dog, and the biggest Gorgonopsid, Eustreptospondylus, was around the size of a lion or tiger. They did not get to the massive 6-meter length that the Gorgonopsids in this show did. And then there's also the misnomer with the Great Dying. It is quite toned down in Walking with Monsters compared to what we believe, as far as we know, happened. In Walking with Monsters, they sort of played off the Great Dying as sort of this worldwide drought, that all the water was disappearing and everything was dying, basically, including the plants. Which is not necessarily true. It was probably far more dramatic than that, considering that the Great Dying, it's believed that there were a lot of Siberian volcanoes which went up at once and created this massive catastrophe that essentially set the sky into ash, similar to with the KT mass extinction, except much, much, much worse. Hence why it was much, much worse than the KT mass extinction. Alright, so now we're moving on to the final segment, the early Triassic. And this one also suffers from pretty much the same thing as the Lake Permian segment, because the segment takes place in Antarctica, and the only one that actually lived there is Scutosaurus. The rest are South African, although Postosuchus was also found in Asia, but that's besides the point. Literally all of the rest of them are South African, while the only one that actually lived in Antarctica, or was found in Antarctica, was Liopleurodon. So, yeah. Euparkeria is quite unique. Now it's portrayed in the series. It is shown as the great dinosaur ancestor, which was thought at the time, but now it's not so much. It is actually believed that Euparkeria evolved its like bipedal movement separately from dinosaurs, and that it actually was part of a different branch of Archosaurs, a different part of Archosaurs entirely. We have found much closer dinosaurian ancestor-like animals like Silesaurus here. It was an actual dinosaur form, or sort of very close to dinosaurs, but not quite. So, yeah. It also lived quite a bit later than when the segment took place. The segment took place 248 million years ago, only 2 million years after the Great Dying, which is different from when Euparkeria actually lived, which was around 240 million years ago or so. It shouldn't have evolved yet. And then we have Postosuchus. Now I only bring this up because, aside from it being South African, the only thing that is sort of outdated is the name change. It is not called Caulkicephalus anymore. It is Postosuchus. And yeah, we have Euchthymobursia, which is the name of the Therocephalian which appeared in the segment. And fun fact, that venomous part is actually accurate. In 2017, they did a study on the skull structure of Euchthymobursia and actually found evidence to support venom in Euchthymobursia. So that part is accurate. Don't have to worry about that. However, similar to Euparkeria, it really shouldn't have been there time-wise at all. Not only was it South African, like Euparkeria, but it's sort of the opposite time-wise, because Euchthymobursia actually lived in the Lake Permian, alongside Gorgonops and Dakotadon and the like, around 255 million years ago. So it should have already been extinct by now. So, yeah guys, that's the end of this first episode of Mistaken Truths. I hope you all enjoyed. Sorry if I went a bit too fast, but this has been a really, really, really long episode. Much longer than I expected, actually. So, I hope you all enjoyed. If you want to leave some questions down in the comments, feel free to do so. And, yeah, some other things. I'm going to leave my Discord in the description. I know I somewhat cut off connections as of late because of some issues, but don't worry. The link to my Discord is going to be down in the description. You can join me, we can talk, we can chat, do whatever. And we're also going to be watching these documentaries together as a group on there, if you want to go down and enjoy these documentaries. Next episode is going to be on When Dinosaurs Roamed America. So hopefully this will come quicker than Walking with Dinosaurs, due to the fact that Walking with Dinosaurs is so massive compared to everything else on here. But yeah guys, that's the end of it. I hope you all enjoyed. I had a lot of fun doing this, although I'm sorry that I took for everyone. I hope you could forgive me on that. But I hope you all enjoyed. Leave a like if you enjoyed it, and I'll see you next time. Goodbye everyone.